This past week, my wife and I traveled all the way from Northern California to San Diego to attend the 2020 Vineyard National Leaders Meeting. This yearly gathering is where our national leadership, the executive team, regional leaders, and area leaders get together to worship, connect, and hear about the state of the vineyard here in the United States. I've been attending these meetings for about 6 years on and off, and I guess I'd mostly describe this 3-day gathering as a place where the national leadership casts vision for where the vineyard is at and is going. It kind of sets the tone for the year from the national movement's perspective. Except this year was a lot different than the previous years I've attended because it was made public that Vineyard USA is in the beginning stages of what it's calling a reorganization. So on this episode of my Theo vlog, I'm going to share a brief explanation of the facts as far as I can recall, and some observations and questions to help us as we move forward. So let's go. All right, the Vineyard is over 40 years old, and we have grown from a handful of churches to spanning literally all over the world. Vineyards are in half of all the countries of the world, and I think it's definitely safe to say that this growth seems to be beyond the scope of Wimber and his original goals and aspirations. But here we are. So a while back, Phil Strout, Vineyard USA's national director, started sensing a prompting from the Lord to begin conversations around a potential reorganization. With nearly 600 churches spread across 16 regions, a lot has changed since the Vineyard was primarily located in Southern California. We now have churches in Florida and all the way up to Alaska. Shout out to Samantha and Matt in Juneau and Dan and Diana in Anchorage. If you've done any study on organizational health or family systems theory, you'll know that growing from 10 churches to over 500 churches requires a lot of structural change in order to keep up with the growth. The fact of the matter is that our structural changes have not developed in a way that has allowed us to both continue our growth and maintain health in our churches. And that's why even though we plant new churches all the time, we're not really growing because other churches are closing all the time. And as many have noted, we are perfectly designed for what we have. And if we're going to be honest and self-aware, we have to note that we've never really been able to break the 650 church mark. Why is that? I mean, there's a huge difference in feel between the Vineyard of the US and, for example, the Vineyard in New Zealand or Kenya. I've had the honor of speaking in both New Zealand and Kenya for their national pastors gatherings, and I can tell you that they have completely different feels. In both Kenya and New Zealand, I was literally speaking to all of the Vineyard pastors and leaders. They are all there and fit into a large room, whereas due to the sheer size of the Vineyard in the US, the best way to describe it is like herding cats. So I think we'd be crazy not to consider it has something to do with our structures, our systems, and the processes we have for doing things. So anyway, here's what's happening. Phil Strout started a team that is taking the next year, or I think up to 18 months, to work on this reorganization and to submit a proposal to the executive team. I don't know everyone on that team, and I'm sure you can get a list of the official members if you email the national office, but I do know a few of the people on it. Steve Nicholson, Jay Pathak, Caleb Maskell, and there are a few other women and men on it too, but I just can't recall all of their names. But like I said, if you actually hit up the national office with an email or phone call, I'm sure you could find out pretty easy. Or just bother Bubba Justice because he loves when you email him, text him, or send him Facebook messages. But I digress. Also, you should probably realize that I don't know anyone in the Vineyard who doesn't see our organizational structure as having some serious problems and challenges. I mean, like, everybody agrees with that. And after we were presented with some data related to our ineffectiveness in mission, church planning, and church health, as well as our inability to really deal with theological issues until they actually become a crisis, I think it was even more obvious that it's about time that we make some structural and organizational changes. Now, in addition to making this announcement and taking a lot of time to answer questions and talk about what this means and what it doesn't mean, and answer more questions and then talk more about what it means and what it doesn't mean, and to make sure that it was clear that it doesn't mean what a lot of people might think it means, and it does mean what other people do think it means, Okay, maybe there's a bit of exaggeration, but if anyone complains who is there and says that they are confused by what is happening, they might not have been listening. Jay Pathak made clarifying comments over and over and over, and you get my point. Anyway, the meeting also hosted two guests, Jim Harrington and Tricia Taylor. They are from an organization called The Leader's Journey, I believe, and they helped the group of Vineyard leaders that were gathered in San Diego to discuss issues related to family systems, handling anxiety, how to process this type of stuff, and a lot of other issues. And I'd say they mostly provided some really helpful resources for everyone to both examine themselves as well as how to better engage with other people. And you may know Jim and Tricia from some of their books, which I've listed below in the description. Several of them I've read, and they're really, really great books. So that's the big news. Vineyard USA is getting an overhaul of sorts. The movement, through the team appointed by Phil Strout, which, by the way, I should mention, Phil Strout is actually not on, is exploring what is going to be taking place in the future, or at least coming up with reorganizational proposals that will hopefully help us clarify our mission and our values, and from the sounds of it, our theological identity, as well as, I hope, make the movement a bit more effective. Now, you might be wondering how this is going to affect your local church, and I think it's safe to say that this is really not going to have some immediate impact on your church. This is still in the exploratory stage, and I'm pretty hopeful that this will affect your church in the future, but it'll hopefully be in a positive way. But as of right now, you should just keep praying and doing the stuff. The best way forward for us in local Vineyard churches is for our local churches to continue carrying out God's mission, partnering with the Holy Spirit, leading people to Jesus, and discipling them. Now, personally, I have a lot of questions, and I'm really thankful that the team made sure to indicate that they welcome those questions and that there would be a website up that would be full of transparency and allow people to know what things are happening in the process. That being said, I still have a lot of questions, and some of them I'm not sure anyone can really answer yet because I'm still processing my thoughts around this issue. And before I continue, I just want to say that while the Vineyard as a movement is sometimes extremely frustrating for me and maddening at times because of the whole herding cats issue that I mentioned earlier, I love the Vineyard, and I've spent the majority of my life within this movement. As a kid, my family started attending a Vineyard, and I've been hanging around the movement ever since. And I've pastored in Vineyard churches for over 15 years of my life. So my observations come from a place of simply hoping for the best, and I'm definitely trying not to be cynical about this whole entire process, but it's somewhat hard not to be since I've been around long enough to have heard many of the things that we heard this week, and I've observed that it takes a really long time for things to change in our movement, even when it seems like there's a lot of buy-in from the top. And I mean, it's probably really similar to how change takes place in our local churches. It takes time. And since I'm a local church pastor, I can easily identify that oftentimes the hopes that we have don't always line up with the timeliness that we also have. Plus, quite frankly, Vineyard pastors can be weird. And I'm not saying that as a non-Vineyard pastor. I'm speaking from personal experience, but we're a little bit weird, dodgy, and sometimes hard to pin down. Anyway, I have questions, and I'm definitely curious about how we're going to develop more ecclesiological structure when it doesn't really seem like we actually have a common ecclesiological position. I mean, I've actually heard the Vineyard's ecclesiological description in numerous ways. I've heard that we're a relational movement. I've heard that our ecclesiology is more in line with the free church tradition, like Baptists. I've also been told that we're a centered set ecclesiology, or that our ecclesiology is Episcopalian. We've also heard over the years that we're an association of churches and not a denomination. The Vineyard is both Pentecostal and evangelical, but those are just theological identifying markers. And I've also been told by a bunch of other people that our hybrid ecclesiology is simply a bunch of churches who share the Vineyard name. Some of these identifying markers aren't in mutually exclusive categories, but I think it's safe to say that the Vineyard actually has competing ecclesiologies at the local church level. And that's why we have senior pastor-led churches, staff-led churches, plurality of elder-led churches, and board-governed churches. For the record, I think we are a combination of many of those things. In fact, as I said, those are not mutually exclusive concepts per se, at least not all of them are. But if you ask me what type of church government we should embrace, I'm 100% for an Episcopalian model because I think, one, it's the most biblical, and number two, it's an effective way to carry out a commitment to evangelism and discipleship, mission, and church health. But that's for another video. Plus, our current structure actually looks Episcopalian on paper, only there's no real authority beyond the local church. And I think that's a problem for us as a movement / possibly a denomination / I'm not quite sure what we are. Anyway, the question is, how are we going to make sure structural changes happen if we don't figure out some of the issues related to our ecclesiology? I think that's an issue. And I'm sure that folks involved in the process right now are going to wrestle with these questions. And so I have no doubt that many of those people are asking the same questions related to our ecclesiology. But as someone who is highly invested in systematic theology within the sacramental world as well as the ecclesiological world, I'm really curious about how that's all going to work itself out. But anyway, I must also mention that, these are just some of my observations about the Vineyard, and they're obviously in my limited experience, but our movement seems to have another problem too that I think is going to come up as we move forward, and that's this. We do have a slight anti-intellectual lean in our movement, and I don't think that represents our national leadership team whatsoever or the reorganizational team, because many of the people on it are extremely smart and have done a lot of academic work on the subject at hand. But it is definitely prevalent amongst many of our pastors and definitely in our churches. And this is a huge byproduct of the culture we live in, and in relation to the Vineyard's historic connection to evangelicalism. I think we have to consider the fact that Mark Knoll many years ago made an observation in his classic book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. Mark said something to the effect that the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. Despite dynamic success at a popular level, modern American evangelicals have failed notably in sustaining serious intellectual life. So as I already said, I think this is definitely connected to the cultural and social issues at work within the United States, and it's being influenced and shaped and confirmed by media and just about every other influential content that people consume on a regular basis. Full stop. You are being shaped and influenced right now on this video, a fact that I do not take lightly, which is why I want to both say thank you for watching, and secondarily why I want to take the time to try and put out meaningful content that is biblically faithful and theologically thoughtful. But I digress. So how am I feeling about the future of the Vineyard? I think I'm partly hopeful. I'm partly curious, I'm partly a little cynical if I'm honest, partly frustrated a little bit, but that's probably from the past frustrations more than anything. But I'm also really excited with absolutely zero priority in any of those feelings. I feel like those feelings are just the range of feelings and emotions that I'm having right now, and I can definitely confirm that I am not anxious about the future. I have zero fear about the whole thing, and I have nothing but trust and faith in Jesus and the work of His Spirit. But we do have a lot of hard work ahead of us, and I hope it really works out for the betterment. I join Phil's common closing prayer that it would be for the glory of God and the well-being of people. I'm hoping that that actually happens with this reorganization. And that's why I'm praying for everyone involved in the process and hoping they can come up with some ideas we can engage as we work toward the future of the Vineyard. And hey, while at the Vineyard meeting, I sat down with Phil Strout and interviewed him for my upcoming Wednesdays with Wimber series. If you follow this YouTube channel or this Facebook page, you know that I regularly put out Wednesdays with Wimber videos and content. And I'll have the first one with Phil Strout up next week, so be sure to hit the subscribe button and choose to get notified so when it drops, you know about it. Anyway, my name is Luke Garrity, and I'm a pastor theologian living here in Northern California. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below and I'll do my best to respond. I'd love to encourage you to like my Facebook page, follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and check out my website, lukegarrity.com. I'm beginning to write more content on my website, or at least I'm planning on doing that. If you want to help support my content, by the way, you can support it on my Patreon page. I have a link below for all of these different places. And I'm also wanting you to know that I am going to be starting a new podcast in addition to the one that I'm a part of called the Vineyard. I'm starting a new one called the Sacramental Charismatic, where I'm going to share more about my journey into the sacramental charismatic tradition, as well as share some of the resources that have helped form and shape me along the way. Anyway, I just want to again mention, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and you can check me later. Peace.